Hello, I'm Michael, and this is Tarot by the Tree. This is a continuation of our concept series where we look at some of the things in Kabbalah and tarot cards that may not be clear to some people who want to do some fortune telling and read the cards. We're actually doing three things today. We're going to look at the Tower card. Now we're going to explain exactly what the Tower card means. It's a little bit supple. We're going to, as a way of explaining, we're going to look at the pseudoscience of phrenology, which is the study of the bumps on the human skull. And finally, we're going to look at the pathways on the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge. We're going to look at the 9 pathways and the development of the idea of the different severity and the different pathways. We have 2 cards, and let's start there. We've got the Tower card and the Hierophant. On the first tree, the place is held by the Hierophant, and this is somebody who takes acolytes and trains them with ancient knowledge. This is some of the wisdom that has been saved for generations, and they take students who can study with them, and they learn a body of knowledge. It can be anything from mechanical systems to brain surgery to weather patterns. It's the learning of a system of knowledge that is based on wisdom through the ages. The Tower card is the other side of the Hierophant, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. This card talks about learning beyond your learning. You have to master a field of study before you can improve on it, differentiate on it, move on to something else. The Tower card is the development of the other side of the Hierophant. The Hierophant, as we mentioned, is a pope-like figure. And this could be any type of a knowledgeable person who is the source of the understanding of a field of study. The Hierophant seeks worthy people to study, and some of those people who have studies may move on to the Tower card, where you have to, in a sense, shatter your previous knowledge to move on to something else. But you had to have had that previous knowledge in order to move on. The Tower means that sometimes we have to learn a system in order to seek greater truths outside the system. We can think of somebody who develops a new automobile that runs on water. It's possible they would have had to master the whole field of internal combustion to be able to move from that field into something else. New treatments for disease, new psychological improvements may all be based on the idea that you have to learn this in order to move on from it. A good example of the Tower card is the pseudoscience of phrenology. And this is just a fascinating study. In fact, it's not a study. This was in the 1800s, early 1800s. It was truth, it was science, it was knowledge, it was a way of protecting yourself and promoting your children. It was believed at the time that active or overly developed parts of the brain pushed bits of the skull outwards. Yeah, I'll move the skull in a second. Now, the guys that started the study of phrenology were no doubt intelligent people, and they looked around for signs of intelligence. One of them was if your eyes protruded, if you had a sort of bug eyes, it was to them an indication that the brain was swollen to the point it was confined and it started to push out. And for a while, it was believed that protruding eyes in men or women was a sign of brain development. They studied thousands of skulls. A lot of the skulls of the men and women they studied were from corpses, dead bodies of scientists, poets, warriors, and criminals from many racial types. In time, they discovered, we know now it's more like they imagined, that all violent criminals had a certain bump on a certain part of the skull, and they began to map the skull out. So they might find that the murderers tended to have a bump here. And in fact, the early text of phrenology actually had a capability of murder section on the brain that was later on changed to a propensity for violence or something like that. But there are other areas. There might be an area here that had to do with art. There could be an area here that had to do with speech. There might be an area here that actually had to do with how easily you were led, how easily you were content to obey the rules. And in time, the brain became quite mapped out. And each one of these sections had an attribute, had a name. It controlled part of our psyche. In time, the whole skull was mapped. And we have different areas. We mentioned violence, which was originally called the ability to murder. We have intelligence, creativity. One of the spots indicated a suitability for slavery or a suitability for a subservient form of life. There was loyalty, and on and on. This brought out a debate. Now, this is interesting. Before phrenology, before people started thinking we could divide the brain up into sections, the brain was believed to have been a thing called the generalized brain. The brain was this lump of electricity and protoplasm and neural connections. And one part was very much like another. And altogether, it was like our computer that controlled our body. This was also, like phrenology at the time, this was also, before phrenology, considered a fact that the brain was undifferentiated. When phrenology started to suggest that the brain had parts, a lot of science was very upset with this. Phrenology postulated a differentiated brain. It had separate and distinct areas. It was also known as cerebral localization. This was a whole new idea. So not only did phrenology bring in a whole new realization, so to speak, that the bumps on the head actually mirrored the activity of the brain, but also the idea that the brain itself was not one thing. It was divided. And this was a new idea at the time. Phrenology was a rage in the 1800s. But to think of it being a rage maybe doesn't quite explain what it was. Phrenology was considered truth. It was considered science. It was considered knowledge. It was considered the proper way to take care of yourself. It was a way to develop your children to their maximum potential. This was fact. And a lot of things spun off from that so-called fact. Let's say there were two people that wanted to be married. They were planning to be married. It would be considered only an intelligent move to go have yourself checked out. And the person who checked you out would be a phrenologist. Might be a doctor with a specialty in phrenology. Perhaps it was just a specialist in phrenology, but they would check out your skulls. Um, I suppose if a couple about to be married came in, perhaps they wetted their hair down to get the bumps on the skull. Ideally, they would shave both heads, but I think that might be too big a step, fashionably speaking, for most people. Two people about to be married would go in to a phrenologist and have their attributes and their abilities studied, and sometimes the news would not be good. If the news came out that one person was adventure seeking and the other person was a homebody, it might suggest that this wouldn't be a marriage of similar souls. If you had a child, and let's say your young son was interested in taking up boxing, again, in the early 1800s, you'd probably take him into the doctor to be checked, and the skull would be examined, and the doctor might say, this child has a real propensity for violence. In fact, he also has anger issues, short attention span, all of this just from the bumps of the skull. And the recommendation might be, don't let him take boxing. This is a child that should learn poetry, animal husbandry, something like that. We have to do things that will stop this propensity for violence, so-called, in this child from developing. Parents would take children in to be tested for what vocation they might be best suited for. A lawyer or a doctor or a laborer. And kids' futures could be influenced by what a phrenologist told the parents. And it was also used for, as time would tell, for other reasons too, a justification for segregation or slavery. Phrenology suggested that certain races had certain attributes that favored slavery or favored being dominated by another race. In time, and this took many decades, remember, this was fact like taking your vitamins, eating good food, exercise. This was considered modern science. And in time, over many decades, phrenology was finally discovered to be untrue. It contained many biases and omissions when they mapped the skulls. In fact, the bumps or contours of the skull do not indicate at all active areas of the brain. It took people a long time of restudying skulls, restudying the skulls of artists and violent criminals and so on, to learn that there was prejudice in the original mapping of the skull, and that the outside bumps of the skull do not correlate with mental capacity or emotional display. But even though phrenology was proven to be absolute nonsense, it did bring the idea, the concept of a differentiated brain into our common understanding. And this is where these cards come from. It would take some study of anatomy and medicine to be able to start thinking in terms of the brain controlling the body. And after that study, they might have to throw out the idea of the unified brain. They might just have to say, no, that's not right. And that's where they had to learn medicine and then step outside the current theories of medicine, and that's the Tower card. They had to break outside of the system in order to find a greater truth. It has now been proven that the brain is divided into areas that do control certain functions, such as speech and so on. Now, there's always a little bit of a caveat. More recent studies have shown that the brain has the capacity to be elastic, especially if there's damage to the brain in the early years. So the undifferentiated brain has a little bit of truth in it. If, let's say, the speech section of a brain in a young child is damaged in their youth, other parts of the brain can rearrange themselves to become a speech center. So the brain does have plasticity. One part of the brain can do what another part is or used to do, but the brain does have certain areas attributed to certain functions, and that's the differentiated brain. The Tower card says a system must be mastered and understood, and sometimes only then can the inherent problems of the system be realized. Phrenology was false, but it, in a sense, accidentally discovered how the brain, in fact, works. All right, we're going to move now to a very important and divisive topic, and that's the pathways on the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. It's difficult to prove anything about the tree of life except that it has 10 sephirot. One of the reasons is that we're talking about concepts here, concepts that develop, concepts that represent, but concepts that are not corporeal things in our universe. The tree of life is an imaginary template that is actually the building block for all concepts and constructions. The tree of life, the idea of the tree of life developed over hundreds of years. It came out of the belief system of Kabbalah, and part of the tree of life, as it was reflected by the 22 major cards of the tarot deck, is that it was meant to explain the practical aspect of the Kabbalah as opposed to the esoteric. We don't have that as much today, but perhaps many hundreds of years ago, the religion or the belief system of Kabbalah actually had some aspects in it, some warnings or some how to behave, some very practical bits of wisdom in it. We're going to move just to take a look at how the pathways might have developed. Through a process of studying and discovering, some of the Kabbalists in ancient times discovered that reality was composed of 10 parts. This is a modern rendition of the 10 parts. The one thing they agreed on, these Kabbalists, was that there were 10 spheres, and the spheres were ordered. The spheres meant something. They had a location. In time, it became more specific, more understood, and today we do know that the tree of life has 9 pathways. The 9 pathways, in fact, are the pathways of the construction of the tree of life, of creation. In a sense, I always think it went bang, ba-bang, ba-bang, bang, ba-bang, bang, bang, and that's one at the top, and then these two appeared almost simultaneously. They would be bang, bang, first one, then the other. So from the top, bang, ba-bang, ba-bang, bang, ba-bang, bang, bang. And that's how the tree of life appeared in those separate
which
evolutions.
represents the divine
Okay, the exactly what Jocelyn is saying. This isn't just, and I'm glad you said that because I was probably going to skip over this. This represents, in a sense, God's journey to a place of relative darkness. And this jagged line, the lightning bolt, describes the Creator's descent into the relative darkness of our world. Okay. The Tree of Life did not just pop into one Kabbalist's head all completed. In fact, today it is still evolving, and we have some, as we'll see in a few minutes, we still have some points of argument or discrepancies in it. The Tree of Life started to come alive in the minds of some Kabbalists, but it didn't come all at once. There were different stages. There was this rendition where somebody, a Kabbalist, was able to perceive the 10 sephira, notice that they were connected to each other, and this was the model that he came up with. Remembering that, of course, that the Tree of Life could be different depending on the angle you perceived it from. Some of the early renditions were something like this, resembling a tree and a root. Again, the commonality of 10 sephirot, but the pathways number have a different number depending on the diagram. This is another one, fairly modern looking, the 10 spheres and a number of branches loosely connecting them. And over the years, there have been different formations where you see those 10 spheres. We know they are somehow connected. We do know the connection of the Fool's Journey and the Path of Creation, but it didn't happen all at once. One of the oldest depictions of the Tree of Life is this one. I think it has 18 pathways in it. So we have the one we just showed that is very useful to all tarot people. This is the Path of Creation. We have an older version which has pathways, but not as many as we use now. And this will become one of the problems we talked about. There's still a little bit of discrepancy. I think the Tree of Life is perhaps still evolving. And this is a very common diagram you'll see if you go on the internet or read books, and this is the Tree of Life. But then you might say, well, this is the Tree of Life too. And it may not be absolutely apparent at first, the difference, but this is a very common Tree of Life. But some people started to suggest that the path from Malkuth to Yesod is the eye of the needle. There shouldn't be 3 paths coming from it. There's only one path from Malkuth to Yesod. That brings us then to this picture. Okay, everybody's happy now. There's one path from Malkuth to Yesod. What happened to those 2 paths that were originally there? Well, they popped up top here over that, over the space. So it seems, which may be a little bit confusing, is that the pathways connect all the spheres, but the pathways may not always be in the same place, but on most trees of life, they will always number 22, and that seems to be very important. There are 22 pathways here. If some people complain about the extra pathways at the bottom, if they are removed, they will be transplanted up top over that to keep the number at 22. For the tarot cards and the reading of fortunes, unlike crystal balls and palm reading and tea leaves, the tarot gives us such a rich array of psychological ideas that we can apply. it can be complex. This pathway we've gone through before will serve us very well. And it's not an either or. Even if you want to cling to one of the established diagrams, remember that this pathway is still inside this tree. The pathway of creation is inside this. This just has some extra pathways as well. The 9 pathways on the tree of life will serve us very well when we're trying to understand the tarot cards.
And the link to Kabbalah.
And the link, thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, we'll get into this. The 22 tarot cards were made to teach Kabbalah. The first 10 cards fit over the first 10 severity. Card number 11 is put aside, and then the next 10 cards fit over the 10 of, sure, yeah. Just as a reminder, the first 10 cards, we have numbers 1 to 10 here. The first 10 cards, lay on that. Number 1 card, number 1 spot, and so on. Number 11 card, put it aside. Now the next 10 cards in order fit on the next 10 sephira. The 0 card is not played. It moves around with the Fool's Journey. And we've looked at this diagram many times. This is sort of the heart of the whole Tarot by the Tree system, and that's indicated in our logo as well. Okay, so we've covered an example of the Tower card, where you have to master a body of thought and a field of knowledge in order to move on and improve upon it. We talked about Phrenology, which was considered truth at the time. Later on, all that reputation was destroyed. There was no truth in it, but one of the premises of Phrenology was a differentiated brain, and Phrenology did open the door to the realization that the brain was divided into compartments. All right, why don't we move on from there? The final thought, we talked about the pathways. I know a lot of different schools of thought on that, and I've just presented what's going to work for tarot reading, and this will serve you, and there'll be no mystery and no wondering in what's involved in it. Joss, why don't we look at some of the questions now? Did I not give you the questions? Here they are. Sorry.
So, Phrenology died, but the idea of a differentiated brain emerged and still exists. I know this describes the Tower card, but could it also describe the Death card?
I think that's just a wonderful realization. It's so hard to get a handle on the Tower card, but we understand now it means something arises out of something that's no longer considered true. And I think that's a great observation. The Death card means new life arises from something that is no longer alive. Something that was alive once is giving rise to new life. So I think the Phrenology idea could apply to the Devil card as well as the Tower card.
Will we ever discover the real tree of life?
No, because there is no real tree of life. It doesn't exist. If you had a rocket ship or a microscope or a telescope, you're never going to find somewhere suspended in the universe a tree of life with golden pathways and all the rest. This is a concept. This represents hundreds of years of developed thinking, and it's come down to the template of existence, and it's just not entirely simple. It has 10 parts, and there's a specific linkage to those 10 parts.
So you're saying I should stick to the 9 pathways?
This will serve you. It will never let you down. It explains everything fully. The idea of pathways is strange. If I want to get from Malkuth to Keter, from the Wheel of Fortune to the Magician, there's a pathway. Now, if we put on something like this, it's almost like, well, why don't I just skip all of these things in the middle? I'll just go 1, 2, 3, 4 pathways, and I'm right at the top. I don't have to go through all the, and that's very strange. These spheres exist in a specific order, and this is the order. And there are no shortcuts, there are no detours or alternate routes.
So why do some people think that they need 22 pathways, that there are 22 pathways on the Tree of Life?
In short, I don't know. It may be that it was an intentional or unintentional red herring to protect the secret of the connection of the major arcana to the Tree of Life and Tree of Knowledge. As we mentioned before, it is a fairly simple trick. The first 10 cards, 11 cards sits out, the next 10 cards, and we have a whole bunch of references and comparisons. The practical Kabbalah emerges from this. But there was an element of secrecy as belief systems were persecuted.
Okay, I'm just going to say there's Kai from Ida, Dua, Milky, and there's a Chinese name that I Googled, and what I come up with is Sui Wan.
Oh, hi. Hi.
And that's it.
Okay, so what was that last question again?
The 22
so it's just caught on, and it doesn't take you much searching to go on the internet or to find books at the very expansive ways 22 pathways have affected tarot, and some of the systems are extremely detailed and complex. For the Tarot by the Tree system, each card is represented by a sephira, and the pathways are only the way of recognizing the progression. The pathways don't exist as having any particular power of their own.
And the sephira has a meaning, like it's not
Yes.
just the name,
No.
there is a designation for it.
Yeah, and we've looked at the meanings, wisdom and foundations, and I don't have that at my
It's
fingertips
right there.
now.
Isn't that on there on the ground? You've got
Oh,
on the other side the meanings?
Yeah, there are meanings on each sephira, and of course, the meanings will be the same on the Tree of Life and the Tree
Shall
of
I go
Knowledge.
down? I
Yeah,
can
if
see
you
it
wouldn't
better.
mind, yeah.
Keter is crown, Bina's understanding, Chokmah is wisdom, Gevurah is judgment, Hesed is mercy, Teferet is beauty, Hod is splendor, Netzach is victory, Yisod is foundation, and Malhut is kingdom.
Yeah, and those are general. Now, we have to apply those in the way that we have learned to do in order to understand them. And we can get more into that later. But as Jocelyn said, every sephira has a meaning. And each meaning is reflected in the major arcana of the tarot cards. And that is the heart of the system. And it is a complex enough system without adding a whole lot of variables that we don't need. And I think that's it today. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.